Okay, well, Bruce Katz was our keynote for last year's Regional Economic Summit. He's the founding director of the Nowak Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University. He's the co-author of the new Localism. Got my copy right here. He's been a scholar and director at the Brookings Institution. He's advised presidents and is a frequent media commentator. Bruce, it's so good to see you again. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
It's absolutely wonderful to be with you. Well,
tell us what's going on.
Well, there's a little too much going on as we're all locked down. First of all, it was a wonderful trip last year, and I really enjoyed seeing many parts of your metropolitan area. And I've reflected quite a bit about how we move from a book whose title, How Cities Thrive in the Age of Populism, to a notion of how cities thrive in the age of pandemics. And if you think about the last year, public health lockdowns, economic contraction, small businesses shuttering, racial reckoning, a lot of the focus, not surprisingly, particularly in a presidential year, has been on the federal government, because these kinds of crises show and reveal when we need a national government to basically help small businesses, help workers, provide resources for health equipment. But I think what this year really has revealed is the highlight of the local and the power of the local. And we've seen that early in the year, before there was a CARES Act, before anyone ever heard of a CARES Act. Cities and metros were establishing their own small business relief funds. They were obviously coordinating around public health. When the CARES Act did pass, I think those cities and metros that were able to succeed really harnessed the resources in such a way with their banks and their community development finance institutions and their community banks and entrepreneurial organizations, so they could reach as many small businesses as possible. And now with the vaccine in sight, hoping, we're seeing cities from Chicago and San Jose and St. Louis really beginning to plan for recovery in ways that build on their distinctive assets and advantages. So a year that reminded us that we still need a national government, particularly in times of crises. They're the only ones who can open up their wallet and provide relief and stimulus. I think it's also highlighted just the power of local networks, which is really the whole thesis of new localism. Public, private, civic, community, labor, environmental. If you come together, if you collaborate to problem solve, great things can happen.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the devil's in the details on all that, right? So maybe you could give us some specific examples of some cities and what, how they actually did that, how they came together and organized themselves.
So what I think we're seeing, particularly around the small business crisis, is the criticality of ecosystems. So if you think about small business, Main Street businesses, tech-enabled startups, et cetera, either less than 20 employees. The national definition is less than 500, but let's just stick with the smaller definition of small business. What we've seen cities do, Cincinnati, for example, is to focus on how are their major anchor institutions, their universities, their hospitals, corporations like P&G and Kroger's, how are they purchasing goods and services? Do we have entrepreneurial support organizations like the Minority Business Accelerator in Cincinnati that help companies, enterprises, mostly Black-owned, navigate financial systems so they could access Paycheck Protection Program loans or economic injury disaster loans? Capital. Fifth Third Bank, the biggest regional bank in Cincinnati, they're setting up a special fund for neighborhood regeneration so they could focus on commercial corridors and main streets and business districts that have been particularly affected because it's those business to consumer enterprises that have been most devastated. And then finally, those main streets themselves, how do you take merchant associations and connect them back up to the banks, to the community lenders, to the anchor procurers? So it is not one system here. It's an ecosystem of different entities, different intermediaries, some private, some public, some civic, and they need to cohere.
Hmm.
Um, Washington tends to think about programs, vertical programs. We'll have this loan product, we'll have that block grant. At the local level, it's more of a network. And I think the places like Cincinnati that operate as networks have really been able to push ahead.
And so when you say the funding they're offering, is that a low cost loan pool at this bank that you gave the example, that type of thing?
Exactly. Some banks have actually provided grants and other philanthropies, particularly around the country, when they set up their initial relief funds. They gave that $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 grants. The CARES Act money itself, in many places, were used in that way. Um, but the banks in general will go more towards debt products, hopefully with forgiveness built into them, or sort of staggered payments, just given how many of these small businesses have had a shutter and are seeing only a portion of their revenue return.
Right. And I think there are some federal laws, state and federal laws that prohibit lending institutions to give money away in some cases. So they
Yeah, it's
really need
this
to go in philanthropy for that.
it's this mix of
Yeah.
philanthropy. In some cases, public authorities had particular access. In some cases, what you saw in Chicago and New York, in particular, the local governments or the state governments provided a sort of a backstop for lending. And then the CDFIs, community development finance institutions, were able to create special loan pools. So there's been a lot of innovation, as always, in the United States during a time of crisis. But I think what it's reinforced is this critical notion that these different sectors, institutions, leaders really cohere, connect, link, collaborate.
Yeah. Right. So specific to our region, of course, the largest industries, as you recall when you were last year, hospitality is one of them, and it's just been completely hammered. Are you seeing other, in your travels around the country, other metro areas or other cities that have had a similar reliance on that sector? And what have they done specifically?
Oh, no, I think the places that were reliant on tourism and hospitality have been particularly hit hard. So I think, and then that just had this radiating effect on Main Street businesses, restaurants, bars, bakeries, all of it. I can actually picture downtown Monterey as we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
I think the theory at this point is, can we stabilize small businesses and their landlords? It's not just the businesses themselves,
Right.
but the real estate owners. Can we stabilize this until the vaccine really can have effect? And if you think back to earlier this year when the Paycheck Protection Program was passed, everyone just presumed, well, this will pass by the summer or the end of the summer.
Yeah.
Well, here we are. We're in December. It's a dark winter. And so I think, though, as the virus is coming, it is so critical, absolutely critical for Congress to provide relief through multiple channels, multiple distribution channels, so that businesses and enterprises, particularly in the sectors that you're describing, can make it to the late spring.
Yeah. So
No
what are you
fault of
hearing
their
on
own.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, what are you hearing on that lately? I know there's been a lot of news yesterday and even this morning, I think, on what might happen with another act from Congress.
Well, as always, this is the back and forth between the House and the Senate, and the Democrats and the Republicans. There was a bipartisan group yesterday that came out with a very responsible bill, about $908 billion, that would cover state and local fiscal relief, small business relief in the form of a revised Paycheck Protection Program, and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program that the SBA oversees, unemployment relief, as well as new funding so that the vaccine can be distributed quickly and other health issues dealt with. So that's a very responsible package. We may be seeing half of that ultimately make its way through during this lame duck session. Of course, the president has to sign it. which is, whoever can figure that one out deserves some applause. So I think what's critical now is to watch what the congressional negotiators are doing. Hopefully we get this package. And post inauguration is where we really need to see the kind of counter-cyclical investments that a national government is responsible for, not just in emergency relief, but in innovation, in infrastructure, in human capital. That's going to be how this economy turns back around.
So what can we be doing now locally, Bruce, to prepare for that money to come in from the Fed?
Well, I think we did have this experience with the Paycheck Protection Program, and frankly, in many parts of the country, it was not the best experience because many of our Black and Latino-owned businesses are relatively small. They're underbanked. They didn't have that friendly banker calling them up and say, hey, by the way, you should apply for this loan, and here's how it works. So that's why places like Cincinnati were so critical to provide that support and financial navigation. So first thing I would do on the small business side, get that task force together of banks, entrepreneurial support organizations, the universities, the hospitals, et cetera. What did you learn from the first go round? Because we're going to see something that builds on that, I think. Mm-hmm. There may be direct funding to cities and counties. Senator Booker and Senator Daines have a Relief for Main Street Act, which was initially put forward as a $50 billion direct assistance, more distribution channels, right, more likely to hit the very small businesses. If that passes, this task force, this recovery sort of war room, so to speak, needs to pivot pretty quickly so your city and county governments could decide how would you allocate those resources to have maximum effect. But right, whether it's a loan product or whether it's a grant, this is really about the network coming together. What we learned the first time around, how do we get better at it? Yeah. Can philanthropy fill in some of the gaps with capacity? So this is more likely to have great impact.
And if you recall, too, we have a large part of our population that's undocumented, and so they can't access federal monies that come down, right? And that was a big issue with CARES. So I don't know if there's going to be allowances or something like that, but it's always a challenge when you're, trying to get money to the people that need it most, and yet it's hard sometimes to get it to them, physically get it to them.
Well, so. I think we've learned a lot, and hopefully we can, first of all, we've got to change the deadline on the CARES Act, December 31st. Let's get a grip here. There's a lot of funding that hasn't been spent. So that's funding that should remain for different players, whether it's cities, counties, state governments. But these kinds of artificial restrictions really need to be removed. The U.S. is quite used to dealing, and particularly our federal agencies like SBA are used to dealing with a hurricane or a natural disaster, a flood that's highly localized and only exists for a short period of time. Well, this is a hurricane that's hit the entire country, almost ad infinitum. And so I think they acted fast back in March. There were a lot of successes. The places, again, that were organized for that, but are also organized for what comes, will be the places that are able to come back quicker. So that's where new localism really does come in. Multi-sector networks and organizing really matters to this.
Yeah, right. We have a very specific question. We only have a few seconds left here from John D. Hi, Bruce and Kate. Have you seen the formula and calculation California requires for small businesses to get the $1,000 tax credit per new employee under SB 1447? If you
I have not seen that. I'm going to just take that down.
Maybe if you can't afford to hire a CPA to figure this out, how is this helpful to Main Street business owners? Good question. Yeah. So there's some technicalities, back to your point about outreach and being proactive to get to businesses. Anyway.
Yeah, these intermediaries that can help guide, advise very small businesses, they're absolutely essential all over the country. Sometimes they're urban.